Welcome to Afternoon Tea with Dr. G and Hot TV. We're going to go over 14 CFR Part 65 today. So you're going to need your FAR FC book. And go ahead and find that section. Get cozy with me. Grab your cup of tea. And let's get right into 14 CFR Part 65. So it says certification of airmen other than flight crew members, because we know that for pilot certification, that's found under Part 61. So who all has to look up Part 65 for their certification questions? Go to 65.1 applicability, and it says this part prescribes the requirements for issuing the following certificates and associated ratings and the general operating rules for the holders of those certificates and ratings, and they have A through E. We have air traffic control tower operators. We have aircraft dispatchers. We have mechanics, repairmen, and parachute riggers. So any questions you have about your certification, if you're one of these entities, you would go to Part 65 and look it up. Hattie B wants to be part of the video. She has her t-shirt on because it's snowing outside and it's cold, so she has to stay warm in here. Okay, go lay down. Okay, now let's go to 65.15. Actually, before we go on to that, I just want to glance at 65.12, which is very similar to what you saw in Part 61 about offenses involving alcohol or drugs. It says a conviction for the violation of any federal or state statute relating to the growing, processing, manufacture, sale, disposition, possession, transportation, or importation of narcotic drugs, marijuana, the way they spelled it, or depressant or stimulant drugs or substances is grounds for. So basically anything and everything to do with getting in trouble with drugs or alcohol can result in 1, denial of an application for any certificate or rating issued under this part, and by this part they mean Part 65, for a period of up to 1 year after the date of final conviction, or number 2, suspension or revocation of any certificate or rating issued under this part. So do not get in any trouble where you would be in violation of 65.12, because if you're going up for a certificate, it can be denied for a year, and anything you do currently hold can be suspended, or it says suspension or revocation. So that's a no-go. Okay, so now let's go to 65.15. Duration of certificates. Just like your pilot certificates, guys, once you pass the exams, the check rides, you're issued a temporary certificate that's good for 120 days. And then I'm asking, how long is the certificate good for? And there are no expirations for any of these. So it says, except for, look under A, except for repairman certificates. A certificate or rating issued under this part is effective until it is surrendered, suspended, or revoked. So unless you get in trouble, there's no expiration date except for the repairman certificate. B says, unless it is sooner surrendered, suspended, or revoked, a repairman certificate is effective until the holder is relieved from the duties for which the holder was employed and certificated. An example of a repairman certificate, guys, is like sometimes, like for example, they have prop repair stations, which those stations have mechanics, aircraft mechanics that specifically work on propellers. So that's an example of a repair station. C says the holder of a certificate issued under this part that is suspended, revoked, or no longer effective shall return it to the administrator. And what did we say shall mean, guys? We know shall means it is imperative. You must. And part delta says except for temp certificates issued under 65.13, the holder of a paper certificate issued under this part may not exercise the privileges after March 2013. We're not worried about that one. So this is an example, guys, of what, for example, an aircraft dispatch certificate looks like. Very similar layout to your pilot certificates and ratings. We no longer use our social security number, so it would have the date of birth on here, your name, address. It says your certificate and signed by whoever the current administrator is. So this is a, driver's license size ID, a certificate that generally we just keep in our wallets, right? Okay, let's go to 65.17. I'm just kind of skipping around a little bit here. It says test. Tests prescribed by or under this part are given at times and places and by persons designated by the administrator. We're talking about the FAA administrator. So there are testing sites available throughout the U.S. Where you would have to call ahead of time, schedule to take your exam. It's a computerized exam. We call them writtens, but really they're computerized. It's just an old way, old term of saying it. So you go in there and you take your computerized exam. As soon as you're done, it lets you know whether you passed or failed, and it gives you a score. The passing score is 70. That's the minimum grade on any FAA computerized exam or written exam. There's different software that you can use to study. I would not take these tests without studying, because it's basically the best way to go about doing this is to get the question and answer bank and go through and memorize the correct answers. There's ASA software, there's Gleim, and there's Shepherd Air, which seems to be really popular lately. So what happens if you go in there and you don't make a 70, you make a 69? Well, there are procedures for retesting after failure. 65.18 talks about what happens if you cheat, and it gives you that information, which you're not, that's a no-go. During the exams, you are monitored. You're not allowed to leave the computerized exam without permission from the proctor. And if you do get in trouble, the FAA will issue like their I guess consequence, but basically your certificate can be suspended or revoked. So similar to any other consequence. But what happens if you fail? So 65.19 says an applicant for a written, which remember that really means computerized in this day and age. It's when you actually go to a testing site, tell them what test you want, you pay for it, and they pull it up, and it gives you the questions and random questions from not everyone has the exact same test, right? There is a question bank, and then at random, you're provided an exam. So that's a written. Then there's oral, which would be the FAA examiners asking you questions and you answer it. And then there's practical tests, which would be examples would be for pilots would be check rides or simulators, right? And then for dispatchers, it would be writing out or planning a manual flight plan. For aircraft mechanics, it would be maybe different projects like timing a magneto, doing different rivet projects, things like that. Practical is going to be your hands-on portion. So it says an applicant for a written, oral, or practical test for a certificate and rating, or for an additional rating under this part, may apply for retesting after 30 days after the date the applicant failed the test. So one option is just to wait 30 days under Part 65. So let's talk about if we're doing dispatch. You do not have to get your instructor to sign off to retake it. So it's different than the pilot procedures. You can just wait 30 days and then retake it. Well, what if you don't want to wait 30 days? There's a second option. It's under Part Bravo. So look at Part B. It says under A, it said or, and then there's a B listed. Before the 30 days have expired, if the applicant presents a signed statement from an airman holding the certificate and rating sought by the applicant, certifying that the airman has given the applicant additional instruction in each of the subjects failed, and that the airman considers the applicant ready for retesting. Translation. You fail the exam. Let's say you fail your aircraft dispatch exam. It's the ADX. You make a 69, 68. You can sit with someone who has a dispatch certificate. They can sit with you, study with you. The test has like a test slip that's printed off, and it gives you subject codes. It won't tell you exact questions because those aren't provided, but it'll say maybe AO2, and that's going to be weight and balance. Maybe there's a B59, and that's, weather analysis. So you'll go over those codes with the applicant who failed. And once you feel like they're ready to retest, on their failed test sheet, you would put your name, your date, how many hours of additional training you gave them, and your dispatch certificate number. and it says that you certified that you worked with them and you feel like they're ready to retest. So you could do that. Theoretically, you could do that the very next day if you sat with them and felt like they were ready. Now, it's not a good idea to take it the next day because you did fail it. It does cost money. You want to make sure you're successful the next time. So you need to really sit down, look at your study books, whether it's actual books with a highlighter or the computerized, software. They have quizzes that you can take. And my advice is always to study ahead of time. Take the practice quiz the night before. If you make at least an 85, then I say you're ready to take the real test. That's my advice. That way you've got a lot that you can drop, right? Getting down to that 70. Because once you get in there and take the real test, guys, you're going to be more stressed out. You're going to probably change your answers. You're going to have questions maybe you didn't see. So that's my advice, is I would not take the real test till you're making mid to high 80s on the practice quizzes. And listen, if you fail, it happens. It's not the end of the world. Your examiner is going to see the failed test. But once you obtain your certificate, guys, no one's ever going to see that. No one's going to care that you failed it, okay? But you don't want to fail if you can avoid it. Because it does stress you out, right? It is stressful and it does cost money to retest. So we want to do the best we can the first time around. All right, change of address. Let's go to 65.21. So turn in your FC book. Oh, the same page. 65.21, what do you do if you move? It says, where did I go? Within 30 days after any change in his or her permanent mailing address, the holder of a certificate issued under this part shall, which means we must, notify the Department of Transportation and the FAA offices in Oak City, Oklahoma City. So who should be notified? The FAA. When should they be notified? Within 30 days. And how? It says that you can write them, but honestly, guys, in this day and age, we're going to go to the FAA website and you're going to notify them this way. If you don't have the link, you can just Google change of address FAA and it'll pop right up. They want to know who else operating in their area. That's all. If you're living in the dorms, guys, I would not change it from dorm to dorm. I would just change it once you get your permanent mailing address. Okay, now I want to go over a little bit about air traffic control. So that first part was just the general part 65, and then they have different subparts for ATC, dispatch, etc. So I want to talk about air traffic control ATC. 65.31 says no person may act as an air traffic control tower operator at an air traffic control tower in connection with civil aircraft unless he or she, and then there's an A, a B, and a C. A says holds an FAA credential with a tower rating or an air traffic control tower operator certificate issued under this subpart. So one thing is you either have to have a FAA credential with a tower rating or an air traffic control tower operator certificate. Part B, another one you have to have, is a facility rating, and that's specific to the control tower that you are working at. It says, or has qualified for the operating position at which he or she acts and is under the supervision of the holder of a facility rating. And then Part C says, except for a person employed by the FAA or employed by or on active duty with the Department of the Air Force, Army, or Navy, or the Coast Guard, I also want you guys to know that you have to have a second-class medical, and we'll dig more into that later. But so the certificates that you need are the Air Traffic Control Operator Certificate, a facility rating, and a current second-class medical for ATC that expires every year. You have to renew it. Okay, so what does it take to be eligible to be an air traffic controller? It says A, so I'm under 65.33 alpha. You have to be at least 18 years of age. That's the minimum. That's the minimum. Now, you do have to have your first job. You have to have your first job for ATC by 31 years of age. I know it's not in your regs, but it is a requirement. So you got to be at least 18, no older than 31 by the time you get your letter saying that you've been assigned to a tower or a center. So you got to be at least 18. B says be of good moral character. And this is kind of wild because this is the only place in the regulations, guys, that it tells us that we have to have good moral character. It doesn't say it for pilots, dispatchers, or mechanics, which of course we know we should, but it's interesting to me that they actually don't put it anywhere in the regulations. So you're like, well, what is good moral character? That's a little hard to define. Sometimes it's easier actually to say what would be considered immoral or maybe not lining up with that good morality. And a few things that they look at when they're hiring is they do look at, they get references and they do contact them and they do visit them. So I've had plenty of students that were going up to be a controller and they put me down as a reference, or they didn't even put me down. They just looked at their records and saw I was their professor and they came to office and talked to me. They also can look at your credit report to see what that's looking like. Like, have you already filed bankruptcy and you're only like 24 years old? It just doesn't show responsibility. Of course, they look at to see if you have any arrest, any felonies, of course, or no-nos, DUIs. They just look at a number of variables, really, but we just have to, all aspects of aviation, there needs to be people of good moral character, but this is one specifically that they look at, and it is part of the hiring process as well. Looking at good moral character. You know, I've even heard people, you know, in this era going on social media and seeing what you post. Do you post anything controversial or that might be questionable? And that definitely can come back to get you. Even Snapchat, the stories that you think go away, there are ways, especially under the federal interviews, that they can retrieve that information. Any stories, even if they disappear in 24 hours, everything can be retrieved and looked at in a hiring process like ATC, because it's a government position, right? You work for the FAA, which is a government entity. So one, you got to be at least 18 years of age, and you got to have your first job as ATC by 31. There are exceptions to that, but it's rare. You have to have good moral character. Part Charlie says you have to be able to read, write, understand the English language and speak it without accent or impediment of speech that would interfere with two-way radio conversations. Because, you know, as air traffic controllers, they are communicating with pilots over the radios. ICAO has designated, you know, way back when, several decades ago, that English is the universal aviation language. So everywhere that's part of ICAO, which is almost every participating nation in the world, if you speak English on the radio, the air traffic controllers will actually speak it back to you. Now, in their country, they're speaking their native language on the radios, but they will speak it back to you if they're part of ICAO. Only a few places aren't, and it would be very, 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 probably like humanitarian missions in very remote locations maybe. But otherwise, almost everyone would speak English over the radios. The FAA is the one who determines your accent and impediment of speech. Some examples of impediments would be, you know, stutter, slur, things like that. You know, you have to be able to speak clearly because people have to be able to hear you on the radios. And then this one we mentioned just a minute ago, you have to have at least a second-class medical, which is issued under Part 67 within 12 months before the date the application is made. So you do have to keep that medical. It does have to be renewed every year, so you'd have to stay healthy to keep that medical certificate. So these were the eligibility in order to be eligible to be an air traffic controller. So now let's talk about the maximum hours that ATC can work. Let's go to 65.47. You know, before we go there, actually, if you're interested in what ATC has to do, the knowledge requirements is under 65.35, and the skill requirements is under .37. So I would like for you to take a look at that. Everything from weather to NOTAMs, performance of non-control operational duties, terrain, visual checkpoints, airports, everything to do in their airspace they'd have to know. So read through those at a later time, but let's skip to 65.47. Says, except in an emergency. So except in an emergency, a certificated air traffic control tower operator must be relieved of all duties. I want you to circle the word all. All duties for at least 24 consecutive hours, highlight at least 24 consecutive hours, at least once during each 7 consecutive days. Consecutive means back to back. So if you work 7 straight days, they have to give you 1 full day off, a full 24 hours, unless it's an emergency and you are working the desk and you are willing and able to work more, right? And you're not fatigued. So go back to the red. Such an operator may not serve or be required to serve. They have an A and a B. A says for more than 10 consecutive hours. So that means you cannot work more than 10, which means a full shift maximum is 10 hours, right? But then B says, if you are going to serve more than 10 hours, notice that one did not say 10 consecutive. If you are going to work more than 10 hours during a period of 24 consecutive hours, they can only do that if he or she has had a rest period. I want you to highlight the words rest period of at least 8 hours at or before the end of the 10 hours of duty. So you can work more than 10 hours in a day, but you can't work more than 10 consecutive hours. Does that make sense? So I have your example. You work from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Then you go home and you're given how many hours rest? Yep, 8-hour rest period. Then you can return again to work after that at 2 a.m. Now you can only do that for 6 days though, right? Because on that 7 consecutive day, they've got to relieve you of all your duties for 24 hours. Does that make sense? Now, they're working a lot less than that, to be honest, based on their contracts and their unions and depending on their position. But oftentimes they take a break almost every hour because it is a lot to, look at their radar and a lot of focus and stress. So they often do take about a 10-15 minute break every hour. So they can definitely be more conservative than this, right? They can develop their own policies and procedures more conservative, but they can't be less conservative. So they're definitely not working more than 10 consecutive hours unless it's an emergency. If they work more than 10 hours in a 24-hour period, that's permissible as long as they're given an 8-hour rest period at or before the end of that day. Okay. Now I want us to talk about dispatchers. Go to subpart Charlie, aircraft dispatchers. Just like everyone else, guys, they have a certificate. So pilots have certificates, air traffic controllers have certificates, and so do dispatchers. So let's go to 65.51. And it says, no person may act as an aircraft dispatcher exercising responsibility with a pilot in command for operational control of a flight in connection with any civil aircraft in air commerce unless that person has in his or her personal possession an aircraft dispatcher certificate, which means when you go to work as a dispatcher, guys, you cannot leave your aircraft dispatch certificate at home. You have to have it on you. In your possession, just like pilots operating civil aircraft have to have their pilot certificate on them, right? And then B says, let's move here. B says each person who holds an aircraft dispatcher certificate must present it for inspection upon the request of the administrator, which is the FAA administrator, or an authorized representative of the National Transportation Safety Board, or of any federal, state, or local law enforcement officer. So if one of these, which honestly the only ones who would ever ask would be an FAA or the NTSB, if they ask you, let's say you're working, they come into work and they kind of do like a ramp inspection, but it's in the office, and they come up to me and they ask me to will you show me your dispatch certificate? Then I need to, show them. It's probably hanging around my neck on a lanyard, right? If I don't have it, then I'm actually going to call my boss and tell him I'm running late or I can't come in today, because you cannot work as a dispatcher without your dispatcher certificate on you. Okay, we talked about ATC. These are two separate entities, right, guys? Air traffic controllers work for the government. They are FAA employees, and they maintain separation of aircraft, specifically IFR separation, and they ensure separation on active runways. dispatchers work for a specific airline, and they work in with the captain, with the pilot in command, and they share joint responsibility for the safety of the flight. So they are airline employees. So their eligibility requirements are going to be different. It's under 6553A. It says to be eligible to take the aircraft dispatcher knowledge test, which is the same thing as a written test or the computerized test. It says a person must be at least 21 years of age. So that's this test right here, guys. The letters are ADX. It's very similar to taking the ATP test, but it is slightly different. So you'd have to make sure you took the correct exam, but it's very similar. It's very similar, guys, because captains and dispatchers share joint responsibility. So an airline transport pilot exam is very similar to an aircraft dispatch computerized exam or knowledge. You have to be 21 in order to take that. And the passing score is just like I told you before, on every FAA knowledge and computer test is 70%. So that's one eligibility. Part B says to be eligible, that was to take the test. Now to be eligible to get the certificate, which is called an aircraft dispatcher certificate. A lot of people call it a flight dispatch certificate, same thing. One, you have to be at least 23 years of age. Two, be able to read, speak, write, and understand English, because that's the international aviation language, right? Three, pass the required knowledge test, which again, you would study with ASA, GLIME, or Shepherd Air to study the questions and correct answers and make a 70. And remember I said don't take it unless you make 85 or higher on the practice quiz. 4 says pass the required practical test, which we call these OMPs, oral and practicals. The oral exam is a 3-hour oral exam from a designated FAA examiner. They ask you questions related to aircraft dispatch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the practical is going to be a manual flight plan. So these are the eligibility requirements. What I want you guys to notice here is dispatchers do not need a medical certificate. Pilots do, air traffic controllers do. Dispatchers, aircraft mechanics do not need an FAA medical certificate. Now, I told you can take the computerized exam at 21, but then I said, but you couldn't get your certificate until 23. So this is how this would work, guys. Like my students, their senior year are generally 21. So they qualify to take the oral and practical exam, but they actually won't be a dispatcher until their 23rd birthday. They are issued what's called a letter of completion from their examiner. And it says that that'll have the applicant's name here, and it'll say like Andrea Georgiou has successfully completed the necessary written, which is the computer test, oral and flight test, which is the practical, for an aircraft dispatch certificate. However, the applicant has not reached 23. The applicant may obtain a temporary airman certificate from any FSDO, Flight Standards District Office, upon presenting the following: that you are 23, you have a current application, and then this letter. So this letter is important not to lose when you're issued it. What do dispatchers have to know, guys? If you go to 65.55 and 65.57, it tells you everything. Well, we've got to know regulations, weather, aircraft systems, wind shear, human factors, aircraft performance, ATC, you name it. Basically, guys, dispatchers need to know everything the pilots know except how to actually fly the airplane. But they do need an in-depth understanding of aircraft systems and limitations. Because if something happens in flight, the captain and the first officer will send a message down via ACARS and will be giving the dispatcher that information so that they can have help. Because they work together, they share that joint responsibility. So like, let's say there's a low pressure light illuminates for hydraulic system B. Pilot's going to send that message to dispatch on the ground, right, at the company ops center. Going to tell them what's going on. Then the dispatcher's going to pull up the quick reference handbook, find that system, and read what all are the implications for that and what's the next steps. Do we need to divert the aircraft? Do we need to turn off some other systems? Like, what have we lost now? What have we not lost? That's what's really important. Dispatchers have all that knowledge to be able to assist our pilots. Subpart D talks about aircraft mechanics, if you're interested, and then subpart Echo is repairman. But that is basically it for part 65. It's pretty straightforward. I hope that you learned something from this, and I hope you have a wonderful day and wonderful night, and I will see you soon for our next video. Bye.